Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Murder is the ultimate crime and holds an endless fascination. In this programme, we're going to look back in the files at the bloody case of Slaughter on a Summer's Night and re-examine it with the help of a 21st century jury of experts. Psychologist and profiling expert Kerry Danes, journalist and crime novelist Hilary Bonner, retired senior police investigator Mick Turner, and forensic scientist Alan Baker. What was the method? What was the motive? How was the investigation conducted? Were clues missed or deliberately ignored? Today we ask, who was responsible for the slaughter on that balmy summer's night? On the night of June the 11th, 1936, Constable William Muggeridge was called to a family farm near Kingsbridge in Devon. A man more accustomed perhaps to confronting after-hours drinkers and schoolboys cycling without lights. He now found himself privy to a bloodbath of appalling savagery. This is the area of Devon known as the South Hams, just a few miles from Plymouth. It still exists in its own timeless world. It is a place of river estuaries, orchards, and lonely farmsteads. Nothing bad you think could ever happen here. But on that summer's night, the young constable arrived at the farm to find blood seeping in a scarlet stream from beneath a closed door. Beyond it, in the upper kitchen, lay Gwyneth May, lying in her own blood, dying from severe wounds to her skull and shoulder. Beside her lay the head and part of the shaft of a double-ended walling hammer. Most poignantly, a pet spaniel licked the young woman's face. She was just 25 years old. Further into the room, more horrors awaited. The policeman smelled burning and bounded up the back stairs to the bedroom of the elder daughter, Joan. The door was ablaze, but dousing the flames, P.C. Muggeridge rushed into the room to find the bed empty, but with its pillow spattered with large patches of blood. Following the trail of bloodstains, the officer found Gwyneth's 28-year-old sister, Joan, lying dead in the passageway with injuries to her head. In the master bedroom, Muggeridge found the partly burned body of the mother, Emily May. Her nightdress was charred. Like her daughters, she'd bled profusely from the shocking injuries to her head. The bedclothes had been doused in paraffin. Lying on the bed was the master of the house, 72-year-old farmer Thomas May. He too had head wounds, but mercifully the elderly man was alive and conscious. "What are you doing in my room?" he asked. "Where's my wife gone?" Muggeridge struggled to take in the carnage.
People, I'm sure, think that police officers go into this type of scene without any kind of apprehension, but actually the opposite is true. Even in a long police career, you won't go into the scene of a murder first on many occasions. The officer who works in a rural country beat will have gone in, found the body of Gwyneth, who'd been savagely attacked, and all kinds of things will have gone through his mind. Is there anybody else in the building who's also injured, maybe alive, and might need his assistance? And perhaps just as importantly, is the maniac that's done this somewhere in the building? Are there lights to help him search? And of course we mustn't forget that in those days the officer won't have been able to summon assistance from his colleagues quickly by personal radio or mobile phone. He'll have had no choice but to go and search the rest of the building on his own.
But whatever trauma he felt, the constable alone was now in charge of the crime scene.
The crime scene in this particular case, from a forensic point of view, is very interesting because there's a wealth of forensic material for any forensic scientist or scenes of crime officer to basically assess. Tom May was fairly extensively injured, and it's fairly apparent that that may have had some bearing on his physical capabilities to commit the crime. So in actual fact, the examination of the room in which Mr. May was found would have been very significant in terms of whether he could have been assaulted in that room, or indeed whether he'd administered those wounds to himself. And the fact that if Mr. May had been assaulted with a particular weapon, how that weapon would have caused a distribution of blood around the inside of the room, and indeed onto any clothing or indeed any other items within that room.
From the horrors of the night, one macabre detail stood out above all others. The two daughters each had pillows placed beneath their heads, and even Mrs. May's head rested on folds of soft material to cushion it from the hardness of the floorboards. This seemed like a caring act. Did it mean that the crime had been committed by someone close to the family?
My first job in newspapers was as a cub reporter on the South Devon Times, a newspaper that covered Kingsbridge. The family were always represented as well-liked pillars of the local community. And every time the case was discussed, the same question remained unanswered at the end, which was, could Farmer Tom really have done it?
But such possibilities had yet to be considered, for now the police had to quickly build up a picture of the May family. They had farmed the 300 acres of West Charlton since the 1840s, closely involved with the local church of St Mary's, where young Joan taught in the Sunday school. For the Mays, continuity was everything. Some of the farm workers had served the farm loyally for up to 40 years. Even within the often oppressive confines of a close-knit rural community, the family appeared to have no obvious enemies. Indeed, for the father, wife and the two daughters, June the 11th was stultifyingly normal. Tom May had spent much of the early evening seeing a veterinary surgeon and an accountant. So who had wanted to harm these close-knit churchgoers on that traumatic summer's night? The sisters Gwyneth and Joan had apparently spent the evening with friends near Blackpool Sands on the coast between Kingsbridge and Dartmouth. The police learned that the May family also had a lodger, 22-year-old farm worker Charles Samuel Lockhart. That evening, Lockhart had walked to a dance at a nearby village hall. He had returned briefly to the farm to collect a coat, and then finally returned home at 2:45 in the morning when the dance ended, letting himself in through the unlocked door. Once inside, Lockhart saw the blood pouring from underneath the door. Later, prosecutor Roberts QC would observe, showing unusual wisdom for his youth, he, Lockhart, investigated no further, but hurried off to knock up the village policeman and two farm labourers. So the police had a total of 3 suspects: Lockhart, the only person at the crime scene and uninjured; the father, injured but conscious; and the possibility that the crime had been committed by an unidentified intruder. Meanwhile, Thomas May was displaying a robustness of constitution that was truly astonishing. Despite his considerable injuries, his skull was fractured in 3 places. The 72-year-old insisted that he didn't want to go to hospital. Police noticed that his nightshirt was dirty and soaked with paraffin and blood, so he had obviously been out during the night. "The man will be coming for milking," he said, and he was expecting a load of manure to be delivered. Thomas May was going to survive and seemed very calm, but the death toll of 2 was about to rise. At 4 a.m, his daughter Gwyneth was brought to Kingsbridge County Hospital, where she fought for her life for 4.5 hours before dying from her injuries. Meanwhile, as the sun rose over the family farm, the police were arriving in numbers. There was hardly a section of the house that wasn't splashed with blood. Although there were imprints of naked feet on the floor of the farmhouse, police appeared satisfied that there had been an intruder from outside. Inquiries continued while Thomas May recovered from his injuries at a nursing home in Plymouth. Then, on Tuesday, July the 14th, police took action that shocked the rural community in the South Hams. Officers arrested the elderly farmer. "I think it absurd making this accusation," he replied. "I love my wife and daughters too well." With his head still bandaged, May was driven back here to Kingsbridge, where at the Old Town Hall the magistrate formally charged him with the murder of his wife and 2 daughters.
Did the police need to arrest somebody and just turned to the only person that they had at that time? Were they just thoroughly incompetent? Or was there something about Tom's performance that night that just didn't sit right with them? So maybe something about him was raising questions and causing the hairs on the back of the neck to raise that highly unreliable scale of somebody's guilt.
What had persuaded the police to arrest Thomas May? What about the possible role of Lockhart or an intruder? Would their case stand up in court against May's protestation of innocence? And if he didn't do it, then who did? The committal hearing against Thomas May opened on July the 29th, with G.D. Roberts leading the prosecution against the farmer. His case relied on 2 pieces of evidence. An examination of Thomas May's feet suggested he had made a journey across the yard to fetch paraffin to set a fire and destroy the evidence. The prosecution's second line of attack was that the placing of pillows beneath the victims' heads suggested a close relative had murdered them. Whose hand but his could have placed those pillows under the heads of the 3 deceased?
This seems like quite a caring and tender thing to do. So what does it mean? Well, quite often there's a confusion between the person and the physical body. And it can take a while when somebody dies, particularly in a sudden or unexpected way, to make that shift in thinking about them as merely a corpse. Now, clearly, these women were dead or dying when this happened to them, but does that show you that the person who did it actually has a very close relationship with them? It could well be the case.
Things were looking bad for Thomas May, although there was still no motive. But Roberts had an answer for this, and it was a hard one to argue with. Perhaps some inscrutable trick of the mind had converted a loving husband and father into a homicidal maniac. May was formally committed to stand trial at the Exeter Assizes. His family had been killed. Now he too was fighting for his life. Because of his injuries, May was allowed to give his evidence seated. Speaking in what the newspapers called a cultured voice, May said that from the time he went to bed until he found himself in a Plymouth nursing home, his memory was a complete blank. Somewhat poignantly, he described his final words to his wife on the stairs before going to bed. She put her arm around me and gave me a kiss and a punch in the ribs, saying, "I have some mending to do, but I shall be up directly." I never saw her again. When Mr. Justice Charles took his seat as judge on Monday, November the 9th, G.D. Roberts noted that he seemed anxious to deal in summary fashion with some of the cases on his list because of the pressures of a heavy court calendar. But despite this pressure from the judge, the defence were about to see their first glimmer of hope. Dr. Gerald Robinson, who attended May in Kingsbridge Infirmary, gave evidence that was to shake the prosecution case to its core. Describing the defendant's injuries at the time, he said that May could not open his eyes owing to hemorrhage and swelling of the eyelids. In one place, the outer table of the skull was fractured. In another place, over the ear, the skull was driven in like a broken egg. For the prosecution, Mr. Roberts now asked, "Can you say anything as to how these injuries were inflicted? Are they consistent with having been inflicted by a walling hammer?" The doctor replied, "I think so." "Can you say if they are consistent with having been inflicted when he was standing up or when he was lying down?" They looked to me as if they were given to him while he was lying in bed. Why? Because the 3 scalp wounds were in exactly the same place. At this point, the judge intervened. Would any of these 3 be sufficient to render him unconscious, he asked. Straight away, my lord, said Dr. Robinson. Under further questioning from the defence, the doctor said the first blow alone would have been sufficient to render Thomas May unconscious at once. Again, the judge intervened. Do you think it conceivable that he could have done it himself? Not the least bit, said the doctor. So it looked as if May couldn't have inflicted the wounds himself to divert blame, unless he had an accomplice.
So were these injuries self-inflicted? Well, it would seem very implausible that they were. But does that necessarily mean that Farmer Tom is innocent of the 3 murders? Well, not necessarily. As a possible scenario, let's say that somebody finds that Master Tom has created this havoc and he offers him a solution. I'm going to make it look as though you have been the victim and not the offender in this case. If that is the case, it's a very, very risky strategy, because I would imagine that hitting a 72-year-old over the head with a lump hammer could very easily have been fatal.
Could the prosecution have done more to prove that May or an accomplice had inflicted his wounds?
At the trial, Mr. Roberts, representing the prosecution case, made comments about the positions of the wounds to Thomas May's body in relation to whether could have been inflicted when he was standing up or lying down. Photographs of Mr. May could have indicated if blood had drained over his hair, for example, or down the side of his face. So I think the issue of whether the wounds were administered could have been better addressed.
But the accomplice possibility was not put forward, and the defence were making ground. The prosecution's case was collapsing, and Roberts knew it. He recalled, "The judge fixed his eyes on me and said, 'There is no more reason for supposing May had struck the others than that the others had struck him.' It was a broad hint that he wanted me to throw in my hand, which I could not ignore. I said at once that I would offer no evidence. A verdict of not guilty was returned on each of the 3 charges."
It does seem strange that the case has fallen on one answer to one question by the witness, the doctor. It's such a fundamental point. Could Thomas May have injured himself or not? What's not clear is how much experience the doctor has of examining victims of head injuries. Mr. May, for some reason, declined to go to hospital. Perhaps his head was never x-rayed. It would have needed a hospital visit in those days, I'm sure. So how could the doctor be so sure that the injuries were inflicted by someone else?
May duly stepped from the dock, a free man. "Thank God that terrible time is over," he said. "I knew I would be proved innocent." A year after the murders, the farm was let to a Mr. Coker of Norfolk, and the implement, stock and equipment were sold. Thomas May was effectively destroyed by the case. Described by some villagers as previously a strict and overbearing man, he apparently suffered a nervous breakdown before his eventual death. Reflecting years later, Prosecutor Roberts could not conceal his disquiet at the sudden and unexpected conclusion to the trial. "Who then is responsible for the slaughter at the farm?" he wrote.
I think more could have been done to solve this case from a forensic perspective. Obviously, great interest was put forward about Mr. May's injuries and whether they were self-inflicted. But obviously, Mr. Lockhart's presence at the scene is of particular interest, and there is no doubt that if, for example, his clothing and footwear was examined, it probably would have shown the presence of blood from the deceased. But again, it's the distribution of blood on his clothing which could have been very, very important.
I think that what sticks out for me in this case is why wasn't Lockhart examined much more closely? Because I still think that his behaviour upon finding blood seeping underneath the doorway was really quite strange. There's something fishy about that I, as a psychologist, would feel compelled to investigate.
But Lockhart had an alibi for the relevant period, backed by a church hall full of people. So he couldn't have been involved in the crime.
I am not convinced of Thomas May's innocence or guilt. A good comparison is the Jeremy Bamber case. In 1985, also in a farmhouse, police officers found 5 people who'd all been shot to death. Bamber supplied the police with the potential explanation that his sister Sheila, who had a history of mental illness, had shot 4 members of the family before turning the gun on herself, when it transpired after further examination, and some of this by family members who weren't satisfied with the first conclusion that the police had reached, it transpired that it was in fact Jeremy Bamber himself, and he was convicted of 5 murders.
It also emerged during the hearings that the walling hammer had been placed in a cupboard in the kitchen the previous evening.
I think Farmer Tom was innocent. For a start, crime writers, like the police, always look for a motive, and there really does seem to be none in this case. I wonder, the 2 girls, Farmer Tom's 2 daughters, had been out for the evening. Could they not have been followed home by what we would now call a stalker? Maybe Farmer Tom went to their rescue when they were attacked. Maybe the axe was kept in the kitchen for just that purpose, for self-defence.
The intruder theory does not provide a motive. Some years after the case, the judge put forward yet another scenario. Maybe there was a struggle between Gwyneth and her father on the stairs. Perhaps she collapsed and was incapable of action. Maybe she fell headfirst down the stairs while still alive and thus received the injuries from which she died. Gwyneth alone had time to put on a dressing gown and slippers. She was not attacked while she was in bed. The walling hammer had hairs from May, his wife, and Joan, not from Gwyneth.
Could the young fit Gwyneth have initiated the violence? After all, hers was the only hair that wasn't found on the hammer, and the hammer was found pretty close to her body.
Was it an intruder? Were the wounds self-inflicted? What was the role of Lockhart and daughter Gwyneth? Nobody was brought to justice for this heinous crime, when a close-knit and apparently loving rural family was savagely torn apart and left for dead, burnt, bloodied, and destroyed. Murder is the ultimate crime and holds an endless fascination. In this programme, we're going to look back in the files at the mouse or monster case with the help of a 21st century jury of experts: psychologist and profiling expert Kerry Danes, journalist and crime novelist Hilary Bonner, Jerome Lynch QC, and forensic scientist Alan Baker. What was the method? What was the motive? How was the investigation conducted? Were clues missed or deliberately ignored? Today we ask, was Edward Black a mouse or a monster? Edward Black was one of life's losers, a failure as an insurance salesman, and pursued through the courts for fraud. He tried to take his own life and failed at that as well. But was this inept and insignificant man who quietly served his church and community capable of cold, calculated murder? More than 80 years later, the questions remain. Born in Burnley, Lancashire in 1886, Edward Ernest Black worked as a collier and then a weaver, before relocating to Cornwall with his parents and 2 brothers in 1908. Rural Cornwall was a world away from the grime of Lancashire, and Edward Black settled happily into his new surroundings, lodging at the clay village of Tregenissy with a Miss Annie Nichols. Despite having to raise her little girl Marion, who was born illegitimately in 1904, Annie held down a teaching job at nearby Carclays School and later ran a village tobacconist and confectionery shop. Black was also involved in his community. Gifted with a rich bass voice, he was a popular member of the church choir. Although Annie was 18 years his senior, the two grew close, and in 1914 became husband and wife, with Edward taking up permanent residence at the Nichols family house. Rejected for military service in the Great War, Edward sought not only to serve his country in other ways, but also to better himself in a collar and tie job. He became an agent with the Refuge Insurance Company. With Annie continuing to run the shop, the Blacks were, to all outward appearances, a loving, respectable and hard-working local family. By the autumn of 1921, the life of Edward Black was on a downhill path. Customers began complaining that although they paid their premiums, Black had failed to deliver on their policies. Around the same time, Mrs. Black's health began to decline. Suddenly, around the beginning of November, the woman took to her bed after complaining of severe pains in her stomach with fits of vomiting. Unable to account for the sickness, a Dr. Andrew prescribed medicine for gastritis. Still, the vomiting continued. Black, who attended his wife with his 16-year-old stepdaughter Marion and friends and neighbours, appeared greatly distressed by Annie's condition and was said to exhibit great affection for her, giving way to much sobbing. Then came a chapter of events that shocked and scandalised the village. On Tuesday, November the 8th, 1921, Annie appeared to be improving. In the early evening, Edward announced that he was going into St Austell to acquire a supply of cigarettes for Annie's shop, saying he would be back very soon. He snapped on his bicycle clips and pedalled away, but failed to return. Later, the bicycle was found in St Austell in the yard of Mr Menier's Temperance Hotel. Mr Black apparently left the town on the 6 o'clock train bound for Plymouth. Despite the obvious stress of a missing husband, Annie continued improving. So much so that Dr. Andrews didn't feel the need to visit on the Wednesday morning. Late on Thursday night, however, the 54-year-old woman took a severe turn for the worse. Dr. Andrew arrived quickly and was surprised at Annie's rapidly deteriorating condition. It was too late. With her husband now seemingly vanished into thin air, Annie Black died from heart failure on the stroke of 1 o'clock on the Friday morning. Dr. Andrew refused to issue a death certificate. Instead, he reported his suspicions to the police. Annie's body was taken to St Austell for an immediate post-mortem. Vital organs were sent to London for analysis by Dr. Spilsbury, the eminent Home Office pathologist. Police stripped the house of bottles, papers, books, photographs and any other clues to Mrs. Black's death and the mysterious disappearance of her husband. Why had Mr. Black fled? Was he a murderer, or was there another explanation?
Divorce was scandalous in the 20s, and what people also forget is that divorces were not that easy to get. You had to cite grounds, and even then, if both parties couldn't reach an agreement, it was sometimes impossible and people were trapped in miserable marriages.
On the Tuesday morning, reporters and photographers swooped on St Austell County Court, where the full extent of Edward Black's fraudulent dealings became clear.
Now, we know that it's possible that he had something to do with his wife's death, and therefore it would make sense for him to flee. But we also know that he was involved in other kinds of criminal activity, and those in themselves might have been enough to make him want to absent himself. So in actual fact, he might have nothing to do with his wife's death at all.
So was Mr. Black fleeing accusations of murder, the scandal of divorce, or financial ruin? A young woman, Nora Smith, complained that she'd given Black a total of £30, a significant sum at that time, for what turned out to be a non-existent policy. And Mr. Lush had paid Black £40 to acquire shares on his behalf, but the investments never materialised. Because of the complaints, Black had been dismissed from his job on November the 2nd, 9 days before his wife's death. Across the country, a manhunt was launched with police issuing a description of a man aged 35, 5 foot 8 inches tall, with black hair, thin face and clean-shaven. Press speculation grew wilder by the day. Had Black fled to New York on a liner from Plymouth? Was he now in Ireland serving with Sinn Féin? Arrest warrants on charges of obtaining money by false pretences were now issued against Black, but a worse revelation was to follow. Police revealed that some weeks previously, a man had called at the St Austell branch of Timothy White's chemist in St Austell and had bought arsenic, saying it was needed to kill rats. The signature in the poisons book was E.E. Black. The whole country, not just Cornwall, was now in the grip of an old-fashioned hue and cry. But young Marion discounted the idea that her mother was poisoned and pointed to the absence of such substances from the house. It also emerged through the press that Annie Black had always told Marion that she was adopted and had only recently revealed to her that she was in fact her own child. Being below the age of majority, Marion was placed into the care of a committee of guardians. Police attention, meanwhile, now focused on Black's old haunts in Lancashire. Their hunch proved correct. After 10 days on the run, the fugitive sensationally broke his silence. On November the 21st, local butcher Joseph Kelly, one of Marion's Tregonnessy guardians, received a letter from Black that had been posted in Southport. Black warned ominously that this was the last letter he would ever write in this world, and that he was heartbroken and going to Annie, God bless her. Reacting to the newspaper coverage, Black was scathing of Dr. Andrew, demanding to know why he had not told others of the state of his wife's heart, but only told him. Ask him to be a man and not a cad, Black wrote. What does he mean by suggesting arsenic? By God, you know me better than that. And I admit I made the biggest mistake of my life when I came away. What made me do it? I can't say. We all make mistakes, and I'm going to pay a big price for mine. But what exactly was Black's mistake? Murder, or simply fleeing the scene? Early the next day came news that Black had been arrested in Liverpool in the most dramatic of circumstances. The landlady of Cashin's Temperance Hotel in Bell Street had alerted the police after noticing that a gentleman guest who introduced himself as Mr. Stevens bore a striking resemblance to the man whose photograph now dominated the newspapers. Her little boy even started making pencil drawings of the newly arrived guest. Just before midnight on November the 21st, the police arrived at the hotel. A horrifying scene confronted the officers. They discovered Black attempting to take his own life. After a struggle, the fugitive husband was overpowered and taken to hospital. Although bearing serious self-inflicted wounds, Edward Black would survive to face the full might of the law. But with no motive established and no sign of the money he was alleged to have stolen, what exactly was the Crown's case going to be? Was Edward Black a monster, or just a mouse after all? The case against Black was building. Before the inquest was adjourned, the jury heard the results of the analysis of Mrs. Black's vital organs. The blood, stomach, intestines, pancreas, kidneys and liver all contained traces of arsenic, which together totaled 3.75 milligrams. The amounts found, it was said, were consistent with the medicinal administration of arsenic over a long period. On Wednesday, January the 4th, 1922, Edward Black was finally deemed to be well enough to be discharged from hospital and brought to Cornwall to face charges of obtaining money by false pretences.
It's quite wrong that someone should face a trial where everyone's already convinced of their guilt. That's not a fair trial at all. And so it's possible to stop a trial before it even begins. Here, there is a real question as to whether this person could even have a fair trial, because the public had already made up their minds. One has to ask oneself whether that was a deliberate policy on the part of the police. They knew that the coroner's court was about to reach its verdict. They also knew that whatever that verdict was, it was likely to be reported in the press.
The next day, Edward Black sat between two police officers at the resumed inquest to hear the jury return a unanimous verdict that Annie Black died from arsenic poisoning, unlawfully, feloniously, and with malice aforethought, administered by Edward Ernest Black, her husband. At the committal hearing on Friday, January the 20th, the prosecution set about destroying the character of this supposedly devout man of the church and servant of his community. Marian Nichols was called to give evidence that Black had forced his attentions upon her ever since she was 15.
We know that Marianne was a victim, that's clear, but was she more than a victim in this case as well? In effect, she's been dealt a double whammy. She's just found out that the person who she believed to be her adoptive mother is actually her natural mother. So why would she be lied to? This is bound to shake her very foundations and sense of who she is and who her family are. We also find out that her stepfather is sexually abusing her.
The unwanted sexual relations continued, she said, right up to the time of her mother's illness. The young woman admitted that she disliked her stepfather, but was entirely in his grip and was afraid to tell her mother because it was now revealed Black was given to outbursts of violent temper. I suggest, said Mr. J. Vivian Thomas for the Crown, the object of that was that he, Black, should have this very young girl as his mistress, with a continuance of the intercourse which had been going on since the girl was a little over 15.
Let's be clear about this. Once the jury heard the evidence of Marian about ritual abuse from Edward Black since the age of 15, they were going to be prejudiced towards him. Here is a paedophile, why should they believe him? That evidence should not, in my view, have been in front of this jury. It provided no part of the case against him and should not have been permitted, and undoubtedly helped to have him convicted.
There are 101 reasons why Edward Black would want to murder his wife. Maybe for financial gain, or maybe she'd just become tiresome. I can't see, however, that he would want to take Marianne as a mistress. This isn't a relationship in the conventional sense, this is abuse. Why would he want to reveal himself for the abuser that he was? And also, if he was going to then leave, why wouldn't he take her with him?
The next day, Black was sent for trial at the Cornwall Assize Court in Bodmin. Flanked by prison officers, the defendant looked a broken man. When the trial began on February the 1st, huge crowds gathered to queue for the limited supply of public seats. In the days before television and DVDs, this was the courtroom drama that everyone wanted to see. The viewers were not disappointed. The prosecution opened with all guns blazing. First, staff of the chemist shop testified that Mr. Black had bought 2 ounces of arsenic on October the 29th. Then Mrs. Ann Best, a neighbour of the Blacks at Tregonisi, described how she had nursed Annie during her illness. Mrs. Black had complained several times of feeling burning sensation after taking the medicine from her husband. Yet when Mrs. Best gave the medicine, there were no after effects of vomiting or burning sensations. To a hushed courtroom, Marian Nichols duly gave her evidence of Black's forced attentions. At one stage, the court watched a demonstration of tea making. 3 cups of tea were made. 1 was left as it was. To the other 2 cups were added 1 and 2 grains of arsenic, respectively, to show there was no change in the appearance of the liquid. But did the prosecution have more sinister motives in staging this demonstration?
There is a possibility that if somebody sees a reenactment of a situation, that it gets effectively in their mindset whereby they think, yes, it must have happened.
Edward Black finally limped to the witness box, clearly still in pain from his injuries. "Why did you run away?" asked Mr. Pratt. After a pause, Black replied that he was in a peculiar position financially and that charges were threatened against him. Asked by Mr. Pratt for the defence about the course of his wife's illness, Black said she'd been intermittently ill for years. To the surprise of the court, Black then strenuously denied buying poison from Timothy White's or from anywhere else. "Did you ever administer arsenic to your wife in any way?" asked Mr. Pratt. "Never, sir," the defendant replied. The prosecution counsel, Mr. Holman Gregory, asked Black to read out the entry in the Timothy White's poisons book. "Is that not your own writing?" "No," said Black emphatically. "I never wrote it." But no handwriting comparison evidence was presented, and the prosecution pressed on. On the morning of November the 1st, Black said the doctor gave him information about his wife's condition that made him think that something was radically wrong. He said her heart was in a very wretched state indeed, and that 2 of the valves were undoubtedly gone, said Black. "You have heard Dr. Andrew give evidence," said Mr. Gregory, "and he said nothing of the sort had taken place." "Yes," said Black. "And is he wrong?" asked Mr. Gregory. "Yes," Black replied. Summing up, the judge, Mr. Justice Rowlett, said the case for the prosecution was under 3 broad headings. That they had proved that the deceased woman had died of arsenic poisoning, that just before she was taken ill, the prisoner had bought arsenic, and that while she was ill, the principal person in attendance giving her medicine was Black. But the judge conceded that there was no evidence of motive, and that the only motive being suggested for wanting to get rid of his wife was that she was a great deal his senior. It took just 40 minutes for the jury to decide that Black was guilty of murder. Donning the black cap, the judge passed sentence of death. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul," he thundered. "Amen," said the court chaplain. Interestingly, in his final letter to his stepdaughter, the devout Christian made no last-minute confession of his crime.
People like to have, they like to build up a story about themselves, and they are the main character in this story, and they'd be quite happy to go to their death thinking of themselves as the tragic hero who's been wrongly accused, because that's an easier way to view themselves than actually somebody who is guilty of an offence. Denial in offenders can be very, very strong indeed. So just because he was allegedly a religious man who didn't behave very Christian-like, I must say, it doesn't mean that he didn't go to his grave carrying a secret. He wouldn't have necessarily felt the need to confess.
Given the fevered coverage of the death, disappearance and fraudulent dealings just weeks previously, could Black have ever received a fair trial? For a start, how reliable or fallible was the medical evidence of the quantity of arsenic in Mrs. Black's body? And why did Black leave home at a time when his wife's condition was improving? Did he have sufficient knowledge of poisons to know that his wife's death was imminent?
I believe a retrial would seem sensible given light of additional forensic intelligence. Obviously the circumstantial evidence stands the test of time, but if samples were now available and the logbook was still available and various receptacles around the house were still available, that does offer up the possibility of additional chemical testing in modern day science.
And what about a motive? Even the judge accepted there was no strong and overriding motive for murder.
There's just something about Edward Black that makes me doubt that he would be capable of murder. Now, I've written a book called When the Dead Cry Out, which is based on the case of a man called John Allen. It so happens that I lived next door to him for several years during the 80s, and I still remember this personable, quite ordinary man, really. And I will always have a lurking doubt that he could really have been capable of such a dreadful murder, his wife and 2 children, for goodness sake. And for some reason, I feel much the same way about Edward Black. Could he really have done something so dreadful?
One of our 21st century jurors favours a retrial, and one feels Black was innocent. What about profiling expert Kerry Danes?
If I had to put my neck on the line, I would say that my gut instinct, and let's remember that gut instinct, a feeling in your water, should never be enough to convict a man, I would say that he did it.
And the law agreed. Edward Black was hanged at Exeter Prison at 8 o'clock on Friday morning, March the 22nd of 1922. Prison staff said he met his fate like a man. But was that man a monster or a mouse?